Welcome back, folks, to another episode of History of Tony, and we are discussing the American Civil War. And there we go. We are now in the first year. We started the firing on Fort Sumter last week, and now we're starting the next event. So let's get started with a little bit of review. Last week, we reviewed the events around the firing on Fort Sumter, Charleston, South Carolina, and that was kind of the flashpoint of the Civil War. That's when the Civil War historically started at that point. Although there wasn't really any battles for another couple of months, but this was kind of the opening salvo, you might say, of the Civil War. We looked at how longtime Army officer Robert Anderson occupied Fort Sumter and held out for 3 months as the Confederacy tried to seize control of it. It kind of went back and forth. Lincoln and Jefferson Davis was having kind of a stare down. Neither one of them wanted to fire the first shot. Ultimately, Davis ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard to fire and reduce the fort on April 12th. Took him about 2 days until he finally choked out Anderson. Basically, Anderson surrendered because they ran out of food. Beauregard kind of becomes the first hero of the Civil War for the South, particularly. And he stayed in the Civil War for the remainder of the war, kind of up and down careers, we'll see. Then saw how Anderson was forced to surrender the fort, propelling the country into Civil War. And then finally, we looked at the life of a man by the name of Edmund Ruffin, who was called one of the original fire eaters. That was one of these really rabid secessionists. And he went up and down the coast of the East Coast trying to convince the state to secede. And he is generally regarded as firing the first shot into Fort Sumter. That was kind of an honorary thing given to him because of his status as a fire eater. And we saw how he, becomes kind of that symbol of the Southern Civil War. And we kind of saw how it was kind of ironic. He ended his life by suicide at the end of the Civil War because he said he wasn't going to live under those darn Yankees. Well, I'm sure he didn't say darn. Okay. Finally, we watched a short film outlining the events of the firing on Fort Sumter. So let's see what happens immediately after the firing on Fort Sumter. For the next few months, both sides are kind of getting ready to fight. The United States is kind of notorious for not preparing for war until they actually go for war. You look back historically, and it seemed like we really many times get involved in wars without being prepared for them. And the Civil War was the ultimate in that. We were not prepared for war. During the first 2 months after the firing of Fort Sumter, 4 more states seceded pretty rapidly: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. By far and away, the most important of those was Virginia. They were the biggest state, they had the most population, and they also had a really long military culture that had produced some of the nation's best military leaders. Virginia was kind of I want to say the king of the states, but it definitely, think about it. It produced 4 of the first 6 presidents. And many of the leaders of the Revolutionary War come out of Virginia, and many of the leaders of the Civil War came out of Virginia on both sides, but primarily on the Confederate side. Now, not everybody in Virginia was secessionist. As we shall see, several counties in the northwestern part of Virginia were heavily populated by Union sympathizers. So they eventually break away and become what we know as West Virginia. That's how West Virginia was created during the Civil War. The big dilemma at the beginning of the Civil War was what was going to happen to the border states. Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri. These so-called border states kind of were between the traditional North and the traditional South. And they kind of had a unique belief system. Every one of those border states, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri, were slaveholding states. And most of them, particularly Missouri and Delaware, had fairly, or pardon me, Kentucky had fairly large slave populations. But on the other hand, most of the white citizenry uh, were very sympathetic to the Union. So they were in a dilemma. What do we do? Do we join the Confederacy? Do we join the Union? And so that becomes the focus in the first couple of months of the Civil War to convince these states not to secede. And folks, they were extremely critical to the outcome of the Civil War. Look at this. Missouri was the key to the control of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was the most important transportation system in the west part of the United States, what was in the West. Kentucky was the same for the Ohio River. Kentucky was absolutely, I mean, it controlled the Ohio River. Maryland was on the other side of the District of Columbia from Virginia, which means if Maryland seceded, the District of Columbia, the nation's capital, would be completely surrounded by the Confederacy. Delaware was never really in the mix. Delaware had a slave population, but they never seriously considered joining the Union, and I mean, pardon me, the Confederacy. And very frankly, it probably wouldn't have made a lot of difference because other than maybe Dover, there really wasn't anything of particular importance to either side. Delaware doesn't really play much of a part at all in the Civil War. Uh, Lincoln recognized the importance of these border states, and a lot of his original focus was to make sure and not do anything that would propel these states into the Confederacy. That got John C. Fremont into a lot of trouble in Missouri, as we shall see eventually. He was fond of saying, Lincoln was, that he said, I need God on my side, but I had to have Kentucky to win the war. Of course, he was from Kentucky. He originally was born in Kentucky. So, he had a little bit of empathy for the people of Kentucky. So, here's the border states: Missouri controlling the Mississippi River, Kentucky controlling the Ohio River, Maryland surrounding the other side of the District of Columbia from Virginia. So, you can see how important these three states were to the success of the Civil War. And they ended up not joining the Confederacy. That doesn't mean they weren't battlefields, because some of the bigger battles, and so like in Maryland, Antietam was fought in Maryland. They saw some very large battles. Kentucky was a battleground state. Missouri kind of devolves into the guerrilla warfare state. It early on is pretty much safe for the Union, and then because there's such a large scale population of Southern sympathizers, that it kind of devolves into the hotbed of guerrilla warfare, along with Kentucky and Tennessee and Arkansas. So the next decision that had to be made immediately after the Civil War was who was going to fight for who. After the firing on Fort Sumter, you have a large officer corps which is torn between what to do. A lot of them were loyal to the Union, but at the same time, they were also loyal to their state, particularly Virginia, as we find out. And, they had to choose sides. What do I do here? And some of them chose sides reluctantly. Some of them chose to fight for the Union, but still had sympathy for the South. Some of them chose to fight for the South and had sympathy for preservation of the Union. It was a really tough decision on the part of many of these people, as we shall see. It is true that most of the experienced officers were graduates of the Military Academy of West Point. A lot of them had been fought already during the Mexican-American War of 1848. So it's not like our officer corps was inexperienced. Ultimately, it seems like most of the competent military officers of the Civil War ultimately fight for the Confederacy. In the beginning, the Union caught up, but in the beginning, it does seem, and historians pretty much agree, that they attracted most of the competent officers, as we shall see. One of the reasons is because a lot of these officers lived in the South, had been trained in the South. Uh, 7 of the 8 war colleges, as they were called, other than West Point, were all located in the South, like VMI, the Military Institute in Lexington, uh, Virginia, the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. These were war colleges that trained Army officers and military officers, and they were located in the South. So it's only natural that most of these people would go on and serve for the Southern Army. On top of that, there was this concept of chivalry in the pre-Civil War South that was much stronger than it was in the North. The North was not so agriculture, was not so tied to the old world concept of chivalry. The Southern people, they just had this different mindset. They focused on values like courage, masculinity, piety, pride, contempt for cowardice, and most important, loyalty. And they said these are so important. They emphasize duty and honor. I love this quote. Robert E. Lee, uh, you know, he had a tough decision to make, folks. He had served over 30 years in the Union Army, and he was loyal to the Union. He called secession anarchy. He did not believe in it. But he said, how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native state? And so he chose to fight for the South. He was ambivalent about it. I've just read a really good biography of Lee. I'd read one before, but I read another one before I started teaching my class here. And Lee was very ambivalent about who to fight for. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do for a couple of days. But like he said, how can I draw my sword on Virginia? He was that loyal to his state. Now, while it's true that most of the competent officer staff seemed to gravitate towards the South, eventually the Union Officer Corps caught up to it. Without a doubt, the 2 names that we most associate with military leadership in the Civil War are Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. I mean, when you think about the big generals in the Army of the Civil War, these are the first 2 names that we look at. And it is true that they played a huge part in the Civil War. So let's kind of look at these 2 characters because they end up being the face of the Civil War, some say. Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was born in January 19th, 1807, at a place called Stratford Hall, Virginia. He was born into a very wealthy family, a first family of Virginia, as they call it. He lived till October 12th, 1870, died in Lexington, Virginia. He married Mary Anna Randolph Custis. We'll find out in a minute who she is. They end up having 7 children. He graduated from the Military Academy at West Point in 1829. So he had served, think about this, the war broke out in 1861. He had served for 32 years in the military before the war broke out. He had been a long time officer. And when he retired finally from the Confederacy, he was the General in Chief of the Confederate States. So, who was Robert E. Lee? Well, he was the son of a Revolutionary War hero, a man by the name of Light Horse Harry Lee, who ended up having kind of a checkered, history. We won't go into that because we don't have time. But Lee kind of suffered in a way because of his dad's financial improprieties at the time. He was a top graduate at West Point. I think he graduated second in his class, served for 32 years. An officer in the elite military engineers. This is something I don't think we realize. At this time, West Point was not so much a war college in that they didn't really emphasize military training as much as they did engineering. This is what West Point was doing back in the antebellum South. They were training engineers more than they were war fighters. That doesn't mean they didn't have classes in artillery and all this kind of stuff, but that really wasn't the focus of the military academy at that time. The focus was engineering, and the elite officer corps that you could join after graduating from West Point was the engineer. And that's what Lee was. Lee's career, for the most part, has been as an engineer, construction of forts, construction of infrastructure for what we call the Corps of Engineers today. Uh, he did serve as a superintendent of West Point in the 1850s, and he absolutely despised it. He did not like being the superintendent of West Point, and he wanted to be back out in the field. And as a result, he volunteered and was sent to Texas as a cavalry officer fighting the Indians in the 1850s until the war broke out. He was married to Mary Randolph Custis, who was the great great granddaughter of Martha Washington. So think about this. Martha and George Washington had no children. I don't know if you know that, but they did not have any children. So Martha Washington kind of was the inheritor of the George Washington mantle. In fact, the case, many of the heirlooms of George Washington resided with the Custis family in Arlington House, which was their big estate right across from Washington, D.C., which, of course, now is the site of the National Cemetery. Uh, he was royalty, folks. That the bottom line was, if we had royalty in America, which we don't, but if we did, he was royalty. I mean, Robert E. Lee was just, he was the epitome of everything you'd want in an officer. And he was a very respected and exceptional officer. In fact, many fellow officers considered him the best military officer in the U.S. at the outbreak of the Civil War. You may not know this, but he was actually offered the command of the Union forces on the day after the firing at Fort Sumter. He was in Washington, D.C., and he was called to the Secretary of War's office, and he was offered the head of the Union forces. And he went home and he said, I don't know what I'm going to do. And 2 or 3 days later, he made a decision and, let Jefferson Davis, president of the CSA, know that no, I will be coming to the South and fighting for the South. Jefferson did not immediately put him in the field. He actually becomes Davis's kind of advisor at the Confederate capital in Richmond. It's almost a year before he takes the field as a military commander. He kind of parked there. In fact, the case, believe it or not, in the beginning, there was a lot of people that didn't like the fact that Lee became the head of the Confederate Army in 1862. He had nicknames like the King of Spades because he was an engineer. A lot of other officers called him Granny Lee. Remember, he's old, folks. He's not young. He's been in the Army for 32 years. He's an old man at that time. So, what about Ulysses S. Grant? You could not have drawn a more dissimilar path to greatness than between Grant and Lee. Grant was absolutely the opposite of Lee in every way. Born in 1822, Point Pleasant, Ohio. Eventually, his family moves to Illinois. He died July 23rd, 1885 in New York. He married a lady by the name of Julia Dent. We'll hear more about her as we go. He had 3 children, graduated from U.S. Military Academy in 1843, and his final command was General of the Army of the United States. Of course, he became ultimately the President of the United States for 8 years also. So let's look at General Grant. Like I said, comparison to Lee, he was as different as daylight and dark. He was born into an extremely humble family. They weren't poor by any means of the imagination. In fact, the case, by the end of his life, Grant's father had become fairly wealthy as a tanner and a producer of leather goods, which was kind of a big deal back in these days. Grant really never had any desire to farm. He never had any desire really to work in his father's tanning shop. What he did have was an unusual ability with horses. It's said that Grant was kind of the original horse whisperer. I mean, he could absolutely worked with horses better than anybody had ever seen. I mean, he was an extremely good cavalryman. But as a youth, he drove supply wagons for his father and raised in an extremely modest home. He went to school. He wasn't stupid by any means, and he was not ill educated. I mean, he had some education. He was appointed to West Point and did graduate 4 years later. He didn't excel. He was in the middle of the class. He wasn't a poor student. He wasn't a great student like Lee was. He was there. Let's put it that way. And like everyone else, he became an engineer. First place of deployment is in St. Louis, where he met a young girl by the name of Julia Dent. Uh, she was a cousin of a fellow officer that he was stationed with by the name of James Longstreet, who becomes a very important Confederate general. Longstreet and Grant were friends. In fact, case folks, you will find this out as we go through this, that many times these officers were friendly with the opposing officers that they were trying to kill. And it was kind of one of those brother against brother type things. He eventually married Julia Dent, but neither family supported. In fact, the case he fights his family because they were opposed to her because her family owned slaves, and Dent's family is opposed to Grant because they were abolitionists and poor. The Dents were pretty wealthy, so you've got a marriage here which apparently was successful in all ways, except the fact they neither one of them really had the support of their opposing families. Never really. Uh, Lee, or pardon me, Grant, just like Lee, served in the Mexican War. Lee had a much larger career and was a much more of a hero, if you want to say that, in the Mexican War. Whereas Grant, uh, he learned and studied, but he was kind of one of those forgetful type people during the Mexican War. In fact, the case when Grant and Lee meet at Appomattox at the end of the war, uh, Grant had never met Lee except one time during the Mexican War, and he told Lee, he said, "I don't know that you'll remember me, but we met during," and he told the place, and Lee looked at him and said, "No, I don't remember." uh, Lee was obviously a little aggravated. He was having to surrender to Grant. Uh, but, they kind of went different paths here. The one problem that Grant developed uh, was drinking. Grant, we didn't realize it at that time. Alcoholism was considered at that time more of a sin than it was a sickness. And as it turned out, that people that investigated the life of Grant and his family, apparently this was a problem that had developed amongst many of Grant's ancestors. And so Grant, by all accounts, was probably an alcoholic. Now, he controlled it for most of his life, particularly the life after, during the Civil War and afterwards. But early on, he developed a drinking problem. After the Mexican American War, he was stationed in the Pacific Northwest, which was about as far away from civilization as you could get in America. Remember, this is the 1850s in the Pacific Northwest. There's not a lot of people out there. And, the Pacific Northwest, while I'll be honest, I've never been there, but I understand it's a beautiful location, but it can be kind of dismal. It's foggy, it's rainy, um, it's kind of depressing to a lot of people. And there wasn't anything to do out there but play cards and drink. And apparently, Grant was not a card player as much as he was a drinker. And he became heavily involved in alcohol in his station out in the 1850s. So much so that in 1854, he was basically cashiered out of the Army. He was told, resign or you're going to be dismissed. And so he resigned, went back home, and for the next 7 years, struggled, folks. Poverty and stability. Not with drinking. He came drinking up during this period of time because he was with his wife. And, she was very much a stabilizing force in his life. But he gives up his drinking, but he's having a hard time of it, folks. He's struggling. He doesn't want to take money from his family. He doesn't want to take money from Julia Dent's family. And so he struggles, just, making hand-to-mouth life. There was times that he lived on a small farm outside of St. Louis, which ultimately became Grant's farm. And he ends up chopping firewood and taking it downtown St. Louis to make money. That's the only way he knows. He's just that poor at that point. Well, then when the Civil War breaks out, he had already returned to Illinois because he couldn't make a living in Missouri any longer. Returned to Illinois and was actually clerking for his father in one of his tanning places of business. And the war broke out, and he volunteered for the Illinois militia. He had hoped, his hope was that because of his military training, being a graduate of West Point, that he would be immediately caught on with the regular military academy, regular military establishment. But none of them would have anything to do with it. He was rejected by John C. Fremont in St. Louis. He was rejected by Nathaniel Lyon, who comes to St. Louis before he goes to Wilson's Creek. He was rejected by several different Army officers because everybody knew he had had a hard time drinking in the Civil War. As a result, he joined in the Illinois Volunteers. Eventually, he catches on because of the sponsorship of one of the Illinois congressmen, Eli Washburn, who ends up basically sponsoring him. If you want to read good books about Grant or Lee, and I always recommend history books. These are probably the best biographies of Lee and Grant. Robert E. Lee, A Life by Alan, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce his name correct or not, Guelzo. I just read this a few weeks back. It is just an excellent book. Excellent. I just finished Ron Chernow's biography of Grant. I've read biographies of both these guys before, but I wanted to kind of get my mind wrapped around them again. So I just finished Grant's biography. By the way, folks, it is almost 900 pages. It is an effort. I'm telling you ahead of time, if you want to read Chernow's book, it is absolutely fantastic, but it is a long read, but good. So these are two books that I would highly recommend you read if you're interested in these guys at all. So, who were the officers? Who chose to go in what direction? These are some of the officers who chose to fight for the Union, and you will recognize some of their names. Obviously, Grant, George McClellan, Henry Halleck, William T. Sherman, who probably next to Grant was the most famous Union general, George Meade, Phil Sheridan, Winfield Scott Hancock, who was named after Winfield Scott, Ambrose Burnside, who gave us the sideburns, Joseph Hooker, who became known as Fighting Joe Hooker. We'll talk about him. Irwin McDowell, William Rosecrans, and in the Navy, David Farragut. So these are some of the officers that you will be hearing these names off and on for the remainder of these presentations if you stay with me. On the Confederate side, you have obviously Robert E. Lee. We've been talking about P.G.T. Beauregard, Braxton Bragg, who maybe was the worst general in the Confederacy, Jubal Early, A.P. Hill, Thomas J. Jackson, who everybody knows is Stonewall Jackson, Albert Sidney Johnston, Joseph Johnston, James Longstreet, who was Grant's roommate in St. Louis and whose cousin he married, Jeb Stuart, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Ben McCullough. You notice I've got three of these guys asterisk. These are the only three that did not graduate from West Point. All these were West Point graduates. And that's a pretty notable thing. West Point was, like I said, it was primarily an engineering school, but, a lot of them had seen military experience in the Mexican War. In fact, almost every one of those people I put up there had served in the Mexican-American War in 1848. And some of them had served in Texas and the Plains area in the early Indian Wars. But a lot of them had really never served in combat. Now, as the war breaks out, we need to analyze the strengths and the weaknesses of the two sides. because every one of them, both sides had strengths, both sides had weaknesses. The Union had a lot of strengths on their side. For instance, manpower. 71% of the population in the United States was located in the North. That's 23 million people. They had a huge population to draw from. And folks, that probably ended up being the difference in the war. I'll be honest with you. It probably was the reason, and maybe I shouldn't say that. It's not the reason, but it's one of the primary reasons that the North won the Civil War. They just were able to recruit more people to fight because the South, by the end of the war, is just about out of people. They have, men, there almost were no men left to fight for the South. They had all fight and died or become taken prisoner or whatever. Transportation, 70% of the nation's railroads and established roads and canals were located in the North. That doesn't mean the South didn't have railroads, but they were not nearly as plentiful and they were not nearly as organized. The North had a lot more railroads, which means they can move troops faster, they can move supplies faster. This plays a critical role in the Union victory. In fact, the Civil War is often called the First Railroad War. Again, we'll see how that plays into it. Manufacturing, 95% of the manufacturing plants and factories capable of producing war material were located in the North, 95%. So it didn't take long for these factories to gear up to make guns and pants and hats and artillery and all the stuff that was necessary for having a competent army. They were able to do this a lot faster and a lot easier and a lot more plentiful than was the South. On top of that, most of the workers in the industry were located in the North, 92%. The South was an agrarian area. It was primarily an agricultural producing area. And they had not really embraced the Industrial Revolution like the Union had, as we'll see. Also, the Union had an established Navy. It wasn't a great Navy, but at least they had one. The South really didn't have much of a Navy in the beginning. Now, they kind of caught up in a way, and their privateers, their blockade runners, made up for some of the weaknesses of their Navy, but the South really lacked in Navy. Again, folks, a lot of people believe that this was one of the factors that caused the North to win was the Navy. We don't concentrate much on the naval battles because it seems like they don't get all the glory that the land battles did. But really, the naval battles in some ways were just as important as was the battles on land. Now, that doesn't mean the North didn't have weaknesses. They had a lot of weaknesses. First of all, as we've already said, their officer corps in the beginning was not nearly as competent as was the South. And we've talked about why the South's officers, why they attracted so many of the officers. The Union was saddled with what we call political generals to a greater degree than was the South. We will be talking later about what a political general was and looking at them. But basically, they were generals that were appointed their position as army officers because of their political influence. They really were not militarily trained. Most of them did not perform very competently. A few of them did, but most of them weren't very good. Another thing that hampered the Union was the fact that they had to go on the offense and they had to fight in unfamiliar land. They didn't have good maps, like the South did. The South knew their land, and the North did not really know exactly where they were going a lot of times, folks. I mean, they had the general layout, obviously. And again, if you weren't from Virginia, you had a hard time fighting in Virginia. And folks, I can't tell you how many battles were fought in Virginia. I'm going to show you a map later on. It is, I don't think we sometimes realize, particularly on the East, how much of the focus of the Civil War was in about 100 miles radius of Richmond, the Richmond to Washington, D.C. corridor. I mean, almost every large battle in the East was fought in Virginia. And I mean, it was really devastated as a result of the Civil War. As a result of that, their supply lines were extended and easily broken. They every time they moved into the South, every time they moved on Atlanta or Chattanooga or Vicksburg, they had to bring all their stuff with them, you know, and that created a lot of problems. Eventually, the North figures out, well, we'll just live off the land. And that's where Sherman kind of becomes important because Sherman, uh, he learned to live off the land, and they would confiscate food and supplies, and what they didn't confiscate, they destroyed, so the South couldn't use it. We'll get into that, okay? And finally, and this may be the most important weakness for the Union, there was a kind of, you know, uh, they didn't know exactly why they were fighting. Let's put it that way. Uh, in the beginning, a lot of them were fighting to preserve the Union. And then that switched to abolish slavery. But yet a lot of them didn't necessarily feel like they needed to abolish slavery. It was a really, they were conflicted. Why are we fighting this war? In the beginning, it was to preserve the Union, but that kind of lost steam as the war dragged on and as the political establishment kind of switched to abolishing slavery. And that sympathy was not necessarily shared by a great number of the people in the North. Eventually it is, but it takes a while, folks. There was a kind of a split feeling about why they were fighting this war. So here's a map of the railroads. Look at the railroads. Look at the North compared to the South. Just, huge numbers of railroads compared to the Southern states. This is the population map. Look at the population. How much, the darker it is, the heavier the population. And you can see that it's very lightly populated in parts like southern Missouri and Arkansas and Florida and southern Georgia and parts of southern Mississippi are very lightly populated compared to the Union. So the Confederate States had their strengths and weaknesses also, and I need to get through this before we stop here. So I might go a little bit faster. The South had a great nucleus of trained officers. We've talked about this already. The South was fighting a defensive campaign on land it knew. In other words, they didn't really care if they had to take the battle to the North. They were willing to let the North come to them. They've succeeded. Now, if you want us back, you come get us. In other words, folks, they didn't necessarily feel the need to win the war as much as not lose the war. Okay, we'll talk about that. The South had food. There was no problem with food, at least in the beginning. As it turns out, that does become a problem later. But in the beginning, they had plenty of food. They had plenty of men. Even though they didn't have a large population, a lot more of their men joined originally than they did in the North. So, they had plenty of men in the beginning. Most importantly, and this may have been the biggest thing on their side in the beginning of the war, was their morale. They had much higher morale at the beginning of the war than did the North. They were just absolutely dedicated. Remember what Lee said, how can I raise my sword against Virginia? He just could not see that happening. Their morale was much stronger. Now, they had some serious weaknesses. For instance, they absolutely had a lack of industrial potential. Not only could they not produce a lot of weapons and ammunition, they didn't have anything to produce them with. As a result, they had to rely upon, good weapons and ammunition from Europe. And in the beginning, they were kind of, basically that wasn't a problem. Europe eventually kind of begins to back off a little bit. But in the beginning, Britain and France particularly were more than willing to share their weapons and ammunition with the South. Remember, it had not been that many years since Britain had invaded America again. They weren't exactly lovers of America at this point. We didn't quite have that special relationship that we now have. We've already looked at the lack of railroads. Uh, they basically didn't have a navy. They get better at it, but in the beginning, their navy was pretty much non-existent. And they absolutely had a lot of population, but it was 40% of it was slaves. And folks, in the back of their minds, always was this fear that the slaves would rise up in rebellion in the middle of the war. I mean, as the men left and went to war, the slaves remained on the plantations, many times in charge, in charge of either younger kids or women, maybe older people. And there was always this fear in the back of the minds of the Confederates. Are these slaves going to rise up and fight against us? As it turns out, as the Union begins to bring them into their military to the tune of about 400,000 by the end of the war, they do indeed fight pretty strongly against the Confederacy. So that's the strengths and the weaknesses of the Union and the Confederacy. Next week, we're going to begin looking at some of the technology innovation. The Civil War is the first war fought in the Industrial Revolution. And there were so many technological innovations that were introduced in the Civil War. That's not unusual. War always produces a kind of a bonanza of inventions because it seems like it just stimulates the brain cells. And as a result, you see a lot of inventions taking place in the Civil War. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's been something that there we go, that you've learned. I want you to be with me again next week because I've got some really important stuff to talk to you about. And it's like I said, it's I just really enjoy this. I'd forgotten how much I do enjoy the Civil War. I'm not a military historian, and I've learned a lot. But again, I want to emphasize the people as much as I do anything else. So, with that being said, I will see you next week, and looking forward to having you with me again. So long.